Last week, my friend Mark and I decided to break the routine and explore a trail we found on an old map of the national park nearby. The idea was to venture down a path no one else knew, just for the adventure. We packed our backpacks, some water bottles, and a few snacks, setting out early, excited by the chance to discover something new. As we moved along, the vegetation grew denser, and the sounds of the city completely disappeared. After about 2 hours of hiking, we came across an old cabin, almost hidden among the trees. It looked strange, with rotting boards and symbols carved into the door that I had never seen before. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and from Mark's expression, I could tell he felt the same. I suggested maybe we should turn back, but Mark, always the curious one, insisted we take a closer look. Against my better judgment, I agreed, and we approached the cabin. The boards creaked beneath our feet, stainy, and the place smelled of mold and rotting wood. We noticed that all the windows were boarded up, and it looked like no one had lived there for decades. The symbols on the door seemed even stranger up close, almost as if they were shifting under the filtered light from the trees. A sense of unease washed over me, and I finally convinced Mark that we should leave. He reluctantly agreed, and we started heading back the way we had come. As we walked away, I noticed the forest around us felt different. The sunlight that had been streaming through the trees was dimmer, and a thin mist began to form. The comforting sounds of nature had completely vanished. After a few minutes, we heard faint footsteps behind us, as if someone were following. We stopped and looked around, but saw only trees and shadows. My heart started racing, and Mark tried to make a joke to lighten the mood, but I could see he was scared too. We decided to quicken our pace, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. We kept moving, and the footsteps behind us became more distinct. Every so often we heard branches snapping and leaves crunching underfoot. We turned around quickly, but saw no one. The mist was getting thicker, making it hard to see. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "This doesn't feel right," I murmured to Mark, who nodded, looking concerned. We picked up the pace, nearly running, hoping to shake off the feeling that something was following us. But the farther we went, the more it seemed like we were getting lost. The path that had seemed familiar now felt strange, as if the forest had shifted around us. We began seeing the same twisted trees and moss-covered rocks over and over. "I think we're going in circles," Mark said, his voice trembling. Panic began to set in, and the sensation of being watched intensified. The sounds of footsteps now surrounded us, coming from all directions. I tried using the GPS on my phone, but there was no signal at all. Suddenly, we started hearing low voices, almost like whispers, coming from every direction. It sounded as if someone was calling our names, but in a distorted, distant way. I looked at Mark, and the fear in his eyes mirrored my own. We decided to run, not knowing where exactly, but anywhere was better than staying still. The laughter that followed us was cold and emotionless, like it was mocking our fear. As we ran through the forest, branches seemed to grab at our clothes, and the ground grew increasingly uneven. My heart felt like it was going to explode, and I was struggling to breathe. At one point, I tripped over an exposed root and fell to the ground. A sharp pain shot through my ankle, and I realized I wouldn't be able to keep running. Mark came back to help me, but before we could think of a plan, we noticed shadowy figures moving among the trees. We couldn't see their faces, but their presence was overwhelming. We were surrounded, and there was nowhere to go. Mark and I stood there frozen, not knowing what to do. The silhouettes began to close in slowly, and the silence was broken only by the sound of our racing hearts. Mark helped me up, letting me lean on his shoulder. With difficulty, we began to back away, unsure of where we were headed. With each step, those figures seemed closer, and the mist around us made everything feel even more surreal. The air was heavy, and a sense of hopelessness took over me. Suddenly, a loud sound broke the silence, like a distant rumble, but powerful enough to make the ground tremble slightly. The figures paused for a moment, as if interrupted. We took the opportunity and, gathering all our strength, began moving faster. I can't explain it, but the mist started to dissipate, and sunlight began to peek through the trees again. The sounds of the forest gradually returned, as if nothing had happened. When we looked back, There was no sign of the figures or the cabin. Within minutes, we found a familiar path that led us back to the entrance of the park. When we finally emerged from the forest, the sense of relief was immediate, though the fear still lingered. We looked at each other, sweaty and out of breath, not saying a word. Our minds were racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. We decided not to tell anyone about the cabin or the shadowy figures. Who would believe us anyway? We walked in silence until we reached the car, and only when we locked the doors did we feel a little safer. Since that day, we've avoided going back to that part of the park. Sometimes we meet up for a drink, and the topic inevitably comes up. Neither of us can explain what happened, and maybe we never will. All I know is that since then, I've had recurring nightmares about those strange symbols, and I feel like something or someone is still watching us from afar. It's a feeling I can't explain, but it gives me chills just thinking about it. Maybe some things are better left unknown. Last week, during a long drive, I stopped at a rest area around 2 in the morning. I was exhausted and needed to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The area was nearly empty, with only a few cars scattered around the parking lot. I parked near the restrooms and got out, still feeling groggy, but something caught my attention. A dark van parked just a few meters away from me. I noticed a few people inside, and what made me uneasy was the feeling that they were watching me intently. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination acting up because I was alone at that hour. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away, and I started to feel genuinely uncomfortable. I looked around and saw a family nearby, one of the few groups there. Taking a deep breath, I decided to walk over to them, trying to act casually. I quickly explained the situation to the father, who listened attentively. Without hesitation, he decided to check out the van. The man approached discreetly, trying not to draw too much attention, but it was clear that he sensed something strange as well. He gestured for me to stay put, and I watched as he moved carefully to a spot where he could get a better look inside the van. That's when I saw his expression change. He looked serious and concerned. When he came back, he told me that the people in the van seemed to be watching not just me, but also other cars that were stopping and leaving, as if they were studying the people. The unease I felt quickly turned into real fear. He suggested we call the police, and by then, I fully agreed. But as soon as we pulled out our phones, the van seemed to wake up. Its lights came on, and the driver started the engine, speeding out of the rest area. We watched as the vehicle disappeared down the highway, and a mix of relief and unease washed over me. Even though nothing had actually happened, the experience left me feeling like I had narrowly escaped something potentially dangerous. After the van left, I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. The father gave me a reassuring look and advised me to stay safe for the rest of my trip. I thanked him for his help and for taking my concerns seriously. It gave me some comfort. But as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of what those people might have been planning. The relief I felt was accompanied by a lingering discomfort, as if I were still being watched. Back behind the wheel, I drove the first few miles on high alert, checking the rearview mirror more often than usual. The night seemed darker, and the road felt lonelier. This episode changed how I view late-night stops. Now, I think twice before stopping in isolated areas and try to avoid driving alone that late. I can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I hadn't followed my instincts and asked that family for help. Since then, I carry a bit of extra caution with me, reminding myself that sometimes a moment of vigilance can make all the difference. Last week, I was heading home with my friend John after a quiet night at a friend's house. It was really late, well past midnight, and the streets were almost empty. We were chatting about the soccer game we'd watched when suddenly I noticed flashing lights in the rearview mirror. They were bright, but the car behind us didn't have any official markings like a police car would. I was a bit confused and mentioned it to John. He suggested we might as well pull over, just in case it was some sort of undercover police stop. Reluctantly, I pulled over to the side and waited. A man stepped out of the car behind us and slowly approached. He was dressed in regular clothes, no uniform, and didn't show a badge. With a serious expression, he claimed to be an undercover police officer and started asking strange, invasive questions. A chill went down my spine when he asked where we were headed and where we'd come from, but in a weird, almost intimidating way. I asked if he could show some form of ID or badge, but he ignored my question and kept pushing with more personal questions. John, sensing how off everything felt, nudged me quietly and whispered that something wasn't right. The man kept insisting that we get out of the car, saying he needed to search the vehicle for safety reasons. My heart was racing, and I felt a strong sense of danger. I looked at the man's face and noticed he was avoiding direct eye contact, which only made me more suspicious. I decided it wasn't safe to stay. Slowly, I shifted into gear, and before he could react, I hit the gas and sped off. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man run back to his car, but he didn't follow us. My heart was pounding, and John was just as shaken as I was. We went straight to the nearest police station to report what had happened. At the station, we were still visibly shaken. We explained everything to the officers, from the flashing lights to the invasive questions and the man's insistence that we get out of the car. One of the officers listened carefully and asked a few clarifying questions. He confirmed that any police stop, even by an undercover officer, should include clear identification. Apparently, we weren't the first ones to report something similar in that area. That made my stomach drop. Realizing that someone was using this tact to approach drivers was terrifying. After filing the report, the officer advised us to always be cautious and recommended we never leave the car without clear official identification. The sense of unease stayed with me, and since that night, I avoid driving through deserted areas late at night. That experience made me realize just how vulnerable we can be without knowing it, and to this day, I remember that night with a shiver. If we hadn't followed our instincts and driven away, I can't even imagine what might have happened.